Welcome back to State of the Nation. Over time, socialists changed the badges on their lapels, their slogans, their colours and their flags. But one thing always remains the same. They climb up the ladder, but once they've reached the top, they pull it up after themselves. The latest example is, of course, Angela Rayner, the Housing Secretary, who infamously benefited from Lady Thatcher's policy of the right to buy. Miss Rayner is now reportedly drawing up plans to abandon the policy, so you can't. The right to buy policy embodies everything that is great about conservatism: the belief in social and economic mobility, the belief in home ownership, in wealth creation and prosperity. The policy gets to the heart of the distinction between conservatives and socialists. Conservatives want to create a pathway to prosperity, while socialists want to keep poor people poor in the hope that they will be a captive vote. The proposed move to cancel the right to buy scheme comes from concerns that the council houses sold enter the private market, but they don't stop being houses. A report early this year from the left-wing New Economics Foundation lamented the fact that 40% of former council house homes sold under the scheme are now owned by private landlords. Quelle horror! But socialists also don't understand basic supply and demand. Property being in the private sector is a good thing. The housing crisis is caused by a lack of supply. We haven't built enough homes. More homes enter the rental market. This actually reduces rents and makes them more affordable. But this move also marks a signal that we're not witnessing the resurrection of new Labour, but rather old Labour, Jim Callaghan's Labour. And here is a glorious moment from the Thatcher years when she was up against old Labour.
Will the Prime Minister take time this afternoon to consider the plight of the hundreds of thousands of council tenants who've been encouraged by this government to buy their council house?
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman is very well aware, we put through a policy of purchasing council houses by their tenants, a policy which was bitterly opposed by the Labour Party, a policy from which many, many people have profited and are very grateful.
For Angela Rayner, the right to buy scheme meant buying her own home and improving her financial circumstances, but it seems such a policy will no longer be afforded to people living in council houses. Up the ladder for Ms Rayner, but it's only snakes for you. As ever, let me know your views on mailmog at gbnews.com. With me now is a friend of the programme and former Labour MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle, as well as my panel of two historians, David Oldroyd-Bolt and Tessa Dunlop. Lloyd, thank you very much for coming in. This is classic socialism, isn't it? Take away opportunity from people, make them do what the state says. State control of people's lives is a good thing.
No. I mean, first of all, let's be clear, a council home is a home for life. It's a permanent home for that individual. And at the moment we have a crisis not just of housing, but housing tenure. We have the same number of bedrooms per head of population as we did in 1978. But what we don't have is the right tenure. If you look at the tenure, we have far too many private rented houses where people have to move every year. It gives instability to children. It gives instability for work. It doesn't allow communities to flourish. And we don't have enough council homes. And the problem is the quicker that you build the council homes, they get sold off. And they get sold off and only about a third goes to the council and the rest, the Treasury pockets into their black hole. So something needs to change. Now, there does need to be a pathway to permanence. And even before the right to buy from Thatcher, there was a pathway to permanence where people could own their homes, but without the big discounts and without some of the other disadvantages to communities.
But isn't the real underlying issue that our planning system has stopped housing being built, and that what you need is a diversity of supply? Private renting is not in and of itself a bad thing. Short-term tenure is not in and of itself a bad thing. It allows flexibility of the workforce. It allows people to move to jobs more easily. It allows people to try something out, thinking, well, we might go here without the full investment of buying something new or the application for a council house. And it's the shortage of properties that is at the heart of this.
Well, I think that you are treating it as one market. And I'm afraid it's not one market at the moment. There is a third, maybe even half of the market that is perfectly satisfactory. It works well. People use it to move around. Students use it to go to university temporarily. And I think everyone would be foolish to start to try and fiddle about with the private rented sector there. But there is about about half, maybe a bit more, that is at the moment effectively social housing. It is private rented property where they are paying it via a state subsidy of universal credit and housing benefit. So it's state money that is going straight to the landlords, whereas there's no security of what that quality of housing is. There's no security that councils are able to develop. And the problem with right to buy, which is the bit that we're talking about, is that if I'm a council and I go to a private investor or a bank or finance mechanisms, which councils are entitled to do, and say I want to build X number of houses, without giving the security that I will get this amount of life of rent, or I will be able to sell it for this amount, councils are in a disadvantage to developers, whereas developers, of course, can say, well, I will sell it at this amount or I will rent it out at this amount. Councils don't know, because they don't know when the right to buy person will come knocking, and it will be taken off their hands at a huge discount.
On the issue of housing benefit paying for tenancies, that certainly happens a lot for social housing, but actually there's been a lot of criticism of private landlords that they don't want tenants who are in receipt of housing benefit because they are less likely to be able to pay any rent increase and so on and so forth. So it's not that group of people that is particularly affected by this.
Well, that group of people are in private rented properties because they aren't eligible for council housing. When the first council housing was built, it wasn't for poor people.
Oh, indeed,
it was actually
right.
for working people. It would be. I've seen if you look at the records of some of the first council housing in Brighton, you had to get a reference from the local butcher and the local baker, from your employer. You had to prove that you were good standing, and that has gone because we don't have enough council housing.
That went years ago.
We don't have enough council housing, and that's why we need
the right to buy.
We need to build the council housing.
As a constituency MP, you and I both found that the only people who could get onto the council housing list were people whose circumstances were absolutely desperate. Yes, there was no chance for people who were working but weren't well off.
And that's what slowly needs to change. And it's a mountain. It's not going to change overnight. But you cannot start building if you've got the plug hole unplugged and you're draining out the stock. I think you need a temporary measure to stop it. You then need to review how you get permanence, i.e., for example, someone can buy it, but they have to offer it back to the council in the long term, and then eventually you restabilise the market.
David, there seems to be a fundamental fallacy in the people who object to council house sales. It assumes the houses no longer exist. But they're still there. They're lived in by the people who are living in them as council house tenants. And lots of them carry on living there for years. They don't all sell up immediately.
Well, as should be a possibility under the system. I want to address one thing that that Lloyd said. You said that we still have bedroom occupancy as 1978. Well, that's because since 1997 we've added 10 million people to the population, as well as not building enough houses. So you end up with a nexus of falling supply and immensely increased demand. And when many of those immigrants are coming here with dependents and are therefore not able to access the already enormously undersupplied private market, they fall onto the largesse of the state.
In 1978, we were able to accommodate most of our people.
Because we hadn't imported another sixth of the population in 25 years.
Even though per head of population we have the same amount of bedrooms, the problem is not the bedrooms and buildings per se, it's the tenure. It's where those bedrooms are. It is the style of those bedrooms. That's the problem.
Tessa, you're desperate to get a word in edgeways.
Funnily enough, I wasn't. I was enjoying listening to these fiery redheads that surround me this evening. I think... I remember, in fact, because we grew up in a tied house, so my father's job came with the house. And my mother really struggled for many decades not owning her own property. And the great joy to her when he died and she moved on into her own home, there's this it was a thrill. Even now, she's sort of constantly changing and upgrading or downsizing. And it is really important. It's attached to the sort of, the idea of the freedom of the self almost must be that we're pinned down by bricks and mortar. So I think that should be a privilege available to anybody who's earning honestly and reasonably. However, we do have a housing crisis, and I don't understand why we can't just all meet in the middle and identify a great big British compromise that we temporarily suspend right to buy, or we much lower the discount, which is what New Labour did. You've accused these boys of old Labour. New Labour just lowered it twice.
But it seems to me that all these things are excuses for not building more houses. So the Tories were...
It's a given we're building. That's why they won the election. Build back better. That was Labour's whole...
They say that, but they've done nothing about the Nutrients Directive, which makes it almost impossible to build. There are so many obstructions to building. So everyone says we want to build more. We said we want to build more. They say they want to build more. But people are failing to do this. And then they say, well, the housing problem is caused by private landlords. It's caused by right to buy. It's caused by immigration. It may be affected by these things, but the fundamental problem is we're just not building enough houses for the population that we've got.
I think there's one other slight PR problem. They've got, and you pointed it out, the wrong woman as minister overseeing this. I think that's a massive gaffe. The do as I say, don't do as I do, etc. And I can't understand why, if they knew that this was coming down the line, Angela Rayner was given that gig. It just seems to me an extraordinary mismatch.
I think that it's slightly dangerous if we constantly say to politicians, you can't have done something legally in the past, that then you can't legislate to make it illegal. I smoked as a young man, not very often, but occasionally in pubs.
Weed or cigarettes?
Cigarettes.
We're not getting admissions.
Cigarettes. I fully support the idea that inside pubs, and I'm being very clear on the inside bit, that it was right to ban it. And I would have supported that in any vote. Just because I did it in the past doesn't mean that I can't look back and say,
but you
actually,
didn't
there's some
financial
danger.
advantage and property by smoking in a pub.
All right.
Also, she trended on this subject for months.
This has set a cat amongst the pigeons, so thank you to Lloyd and my panel.